Welcome to Electronics Unmasked. Today it's really going to be very interesting. The method I introduce might be interesting for you. Where is the most of your heating energy being lost? Which renovation measures are cost effective? We predict and we explain the efficiency report for a house. In the previous videos I have explained how to map the average temperatures over the year, the temperature control and the thermal insulation properties of a house. I also mentioned the energy efficiency index for the entire house, which is prominently displayed in our Excel tool. However, our tool also offers a very interesting energy performance report, from which we can derive a lot more interesting information. In this episode I explain all the details of the report, and as always I will play with a few inputs to show interesting implications and effects. I always like to start with our 4-story example house. But before I forget to say, you can simulate many other house types with our tool. You can depict a gable roof or a flat roof, you can reduce the number of floors, and you can omit the basement. In our Excel tool you can choose arbitrary boundary surfaces between all floors, and you can assign arbitrary insulation properties. So it would be also possible to map a house with nested floors. However, I haven't shown you an example yet for the latter. Should I also explain how to do that? Write me in the comments. You can download the Excel tool and play directly with example data. Of course, it would be ideal for you if you had already mapped your house in the tool. I explained the details on this in earlier videos, which I link to you in the top right corner. You don't miss any new videos if you subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Okay, so let's assume that you have entered all the information for your house as in this example. Then you will get this report, which we will now look at in detail. By the way, I like to save this report as a PDF file so that I can compare different scenarios later. Alternatively, you could also print out the report, but I am avoiding that as far as possible. What information is the report giving us? First of all, the relevant temperature profiles for our calculations are summarized here at the top left. We have the night and day outside temperatures for each month. Then we have an overview of the temperature profiles on the different floors, also at night and during the day. In the last line we have the temperature in the ground. At the top right we get the energy efficiency indicator in kilowatt hours per square meter and per year for each floor separately. The value on the left applies to the heating energy, the value on the right applies to the air conditioning. In order to understand the power of the small tool, I want to briefly demonstrate something here. We look at the energy efficiency indicators of the individual floors while I'm changing some inputs. I go back to the environment and targets sheet. Then I turn off the heating and air conditioning in the attic at night. We can already see that this reduces the total energy consumption from 120.8 to 115.5 kilowatt hours. Now let's look at the details in the report. As expected, the energy consumption in the attic lowered significantly, but on the floor below, consumption has increased slightly. The reason for this is that at night thermal energy from the floor below flows through the false ceiling into the attic. Also interesting, in the temperature overview, we can now see what temperatures are reached in the attic when the heating is switched off at night. Next, we turn off the heating in the attic during the day as well. Our report correctly tells us that no more energy is used in the attic. On the floor below, however, consumption raised again and is now 221.0 kilowatt hours, because even more heating energy now flows up through the ceiling. Now we are going to the sheet Buildings Properties and Tariffs. We virtually install a good thermal insulation in the attic. This gives the false ceiling a U value of 0.2, which previously had a value of 4.0. This reduces the energy consumption on the floor below to a value of 135.8 kilowatt hours per square meter. That makes really a big difference. This measure would reduce annual heating energy consumption by 39% on this floor. But be careful, look at the temperatures. Now it can get very cold in the attic in winter. So, I think it has become clear. In this overview, you get an instant and detailed feedback on the impact of every change you make. This could be renovation measures or simply changed temperature settings on your heating. I'm always impressed by getting such realistic calculations from this tool. If you calculate different scenarios, I recommend that you always enter your own comments in this field. In later comparisons, you can immediately see which scenario the respective analysis is based on. Then there is information about the tariffs, which define finally the cost for the energy. The tariffs are of course also adjustable. I will go into more detail in a later video. On the far right you can see whether or not we take into account the sun and the waste heat from electrical devices and people. At the moment these functions are all switched off. If you want to use these functions, you have to provide the appropriate information, which I will explain in detail also in a later video. Below we get an overview of the energy budgets on all floors, including the CO2 production, the energy efficiency indicators and the cost. At the bottom we find the totals for the whole house. Now you might ask how these parameters and the costs come about. And there are a few hidden functions that are giving the answers. We can open a second level on our Excel sheet, which then gives us a lot more detailed information. First we see the graphical representation of our temperature curves throughout the year. This graph allows us to see at a glance whether our data is plausible and consistent. This is certainly helpful if you have to search for errors in the entries. And then we get other very interesting details. Here we see the heat energy fluxes through each boundary area, like walls, windows, etc., that we have defined in each month. A positive number of kilowatt hours means that thermal energy is flowing out of this room. A negative number means that thermal energy is flowing in. We now interpret the values for our attic as follows. Thermal energy escapes through the outer walls, the roof and the windows. And each month as much as we get displayed here. But then heat energy also flows from the floor below through the false ceiling into the attic. We see that here. This process sometimes reverses during the day in summer, as you can see here. However, the sum of the energy flows in the attic is 0 because we switched off the heating. Therefore, there is no cost at the end of the day. The data of the first floor looks completely different. Here we lose thermal energy through external walls, windows, and this time also doors. In addition, we also lose energy to the attic. And this process is also sometimes reversed in summer. In the total for the first floor, we now see the energy that we have to use to maintain the temperature that we set on the heating thermostat. In winter, this energy comes from heating, and in summer we sometimes need cooling as well, which is shown to us by the negative numbers in the summer. Using this data, we can analyze exactly where and how much heating energy we need. That information could be very helpful when planning renovations, right? That was the 6th part of our step-by-step user's guide. I hope I was able to motivate you to play and analyze a bit with the Excel tool. And as I said, there will be more episodes in which we will show examples and in particular discuss results and reports. There are still a few more functions that I did not explain yet. For example, how to predict the effect of the sun on our heating energy use. This will be subject to one of the coming episodes. If there are any questions about this part, please ask in the comments. I will be happy to answer that. Now stay tuned and don't forget to support the channel. See you soon in the coming episodes.